who was it? Frazier Smith told me something at Nats that was kind of cool. He said, if you win or top a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament, you're probably good, but you're definitely lucky, which is.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, Frazier was cooking with that one for sure.
All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. So the truth about Edison format, the main thing I wanted to talk about in this video is bracket luck. And this is something that I feel like we don't talk about enough as a community when we look at the top 8 decks or whatever of any given tournament, and they're all so different. Pretty much from tournament to tournament. Like we had 2 weeks where dragons won 2 different builds of dragons, and then there was a lot of like diva hero, and sometimes you get a lot of black wings, sometimes you get no black wings and just a bunch of heroes and all types of stuff. Edison is a very inconsistent format, so I attribute a lot of that to what you actually play in any given tournament. And this is only true really with formats like Edison because there are so many viable decks. Even if they aren't necessarily S tier decks or whatever, there are over 20 plus decks that I can think off the top of my head. If you just look at my recent tier list video, I think I covered 27 or 28 decks in that video alone. And I actually skipped some decks because I just don't even feel like placing them or talking about them, but they are also decks that technically could beat you. The truth is that Edison format isn't like a lot of other formats in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where they're named after a deck, right? So you have formats like Teledad or Tengu Plant or Tearlaments, Dragon Rulers, Hat format, etc. All of those formats are named after one specific deck, and that's for a reason, right? Like Necros format is called Necros format for a reason. Edison format, on the other hand, there is a lot of diversity, a lot of playable decks, and because the format is so inconsistent, because the decks are like, there's some really good ones, but they're still so inconsistent. And that just means that all of them can beat you. Despite what the tier lists say, like we all do them, all the Yu-Gi tubers, we're all doing tier lists every couple months or whatever like that. But at the end of the day, you know, like I know, as good as the Blackwing deck is, or as good as the Frog deck is, or as good as the Diva Hero deck is, you can just get shit on by anything in Edison format. And in formats like Tearlaments, you don't have to think about, oh, is my deck going to run into a bad bracket? That's not a real thing. Like your deck is so consistent and so overpowered that there is no matchup you could play against that will actually make you cringe. Whereas again, if I'm playing an Edison format with my Frog deck and I go against GBs round 1, I'm not happy because that deck has a main deck searchable DD Crow built into it. I don't want to play against that shit. If I'm in Teledad format, again, I don't care what I play throughout my 10 rounds of Swiss. It doesn't matter. I'm playing Teledad. I'm playing the best deck. I'm playing the name of the format's deck. And I know a lot of people ask me how do I feel about Tengu Plant's format, but the fact is the format is named Tengu Plant format. And as much as people try to cope and say that, oh, there's like a lot of diversity in that format, you can play all these different decks, I'm waiting to see how true that really is, like how viable those decks actually are compared to Agents, Tengu, and Heroes, which I would say are like the top 3. Because when I look at tournaments for Tengu Plant format, I typically do just see those 3 decks dominating and really not much else. And that could just be on the fact that the community isn't innovating enough or pushing it enough or whatever. But Edison, on the other hand, again, there are like 20 plus playable decks, 20 plus decks that have topped in this year alone. And I just don't know whatever format has that much diversity. So in any given tournament, when you play, you could run into obviously your worst nightmare, and that will change your entire tournament experience. For example, as you know, I like to play Frogs, but I do not want to go against a deck like Gladiator Beast in the first 2 rounds, since those are the only 2 rounds where Gladiator Beasts are still going to be undefeated, because it's a really bad matchup for the deck. And I don't really build my deck to beat Glad Beasts or to handle a matchup like that because the odds of playing against it are very low. It's not a well-represented deck. But if you get unlucky and you end up playing against it, you're in a pretty terrible spot. The same can be true about like if you're playing Fairies and you play against Dragon Turbo, or you play against a deck that can side deck multiple copies of Deck Devastation Virus easily, or if you're the Glad Beast player and you run into too much Hero Beat, too much Blackwings, decks that naturally have 1800 attack power monsters that are easy to summon, and they also have very chainable spell and trap cards that destroy things and just makes it a hard time for your strategy to get off the ground, you're probably not going to do well at that tournament. And the reality is that if you run into some of these bad matchups, oftentimes you won't even have a side deck for it, because as the format progresses and there are more viable decks, more powerful decks, decks are getting more refined, the side deck is getting tighter and tighter. There was a time where I kind of had a hard time filling up my side deck, and now I feel like I don't have enough room in my side deck. So I just have to say, screw it, I'm not going to play against this deck at all, right? Like, I would love to side Mind Crush right now, just in case I ever play against Light Sworn or Christia Sworn or anything like that. But I just don't have room. It's also really good against things like Dragon Turbo. But again, like, what are the odds that you actually play against Dragon Turbo or Christia Sworn in any given tournament? Those decks aren't well represented, despite the fact that they are powerful decks that can beat you despite their inconsistencies. It's just annoying that if you go against them, oftentimes you just won't have anything for them. What I will say, though, is I'm starting to be under the impression that it is a good idea to side one-ofs. And this is something that we've seen really good players do in the past already. I remember covering the PS5 tournament back in February of this year, had about 100 players, and it was in the Philadelphia area. And Steve Silverman, a person who's won 3 YCSs in his life, he notoriously sides one-ofs. He loves playing his one-of copies of things, and he's always been that way ever since back to like 2008, where I think he topped his first major tournament, Shonen Jump Championship with Gladbees. He still liked siding one-of copies of cards back then. And to a lot of people, that seems strange because when you're side decking, you're saying to yourself, okay, this matchup is a little tricky or a little hard for my deck. I want as many blowout cards as possible and probably as many copies of them as possible to beat them. But I think that Silverman has always wanted more options as opposed to just having the same option multiple times. And when you think about it, that also makes sense when you consider that a lot of times you don't want to draw too many of the same card in any duel. Like, honestly, as much as I love pulling the rug or skill drain or royal decree, I rarely do you ever want to side deck multiple copies and see both copies of the card, right? I've even found myself siding one-ofs. Like, you see me siding the 1 Torrential, the 1 Compulse, the 1 Unifrog, 1 Mirror Force, because side decking space is so tight, and I just need to cover multiple matchups with my side deck, which is honestly the goal always. But now that there are so many decks that are viable and you don't know what your bracket is going to be, you just have to have so many options. When I first started playing Edison format in 2022, I remember every side deck started with like double Cyber Dragon, 2 or 3 DD Crows, and then you built your side deck from there. You basically had anywhere from 10 to 11 spots, depending on how many copies of DD Crow you wanted to play, but it was always 2 Cyber Dragons, double Crow, if not more, and then everything else came after that. Usually, like, Dust Tornado is a really popular side deck card as well. But now I don't even feel that strongly about Cyber Dragon or DD Crow. Like, machine decks aren't really it right now, and I don't know if they ever will be again. Like, yeah, people can play Machina Control or Gadgets or whatever, but those decks go in and out of the meta, and they're not really even that good compared to the S tier decks, so you don't really run into them that often in tournaments. And in my opinion, if I'm siding Cyber Dragon, I really want it against machine decks, not necessarily though against other decks that it's kind of okay against. Like, it is okay against Hero Beat, but I'd argue that it's not even that good against the newer Hero Beat that plays Diva, because before they used to play a very small monster count and they summon an alias, and that was their win condition to just beat you down with this alias forever, right? But now they're doing a lot more with Miracle Fusion faster and Diva going into Magical Android and stuff like that, and that makes where Cyber Dragon is kind of awkward in a lot of cases. So I feel like that card isn't even as good as it used to be. And then again, Cyber Dragon is good against things like Anti-Meta or Gladbeast, which those decks also aren't very well represented in the format. But to the original point about bracket luck, and this is something that I really heard a lot being talked about in Smash Ultimate, and I love Smash Bros. Like, I'm a really big fan of Smash Ultimate. I follow a lot of the content. Every time there's a tournament on the weekends, I'm pretty much watching Twitch and seeing who's doing well. My favorite player is Tweak. He plays Diddy Kong. I'm also a Diddy Kong player. So for people who know anything about Smash Ultimate, you know that that game has 86 characters in it. And yes, there's a tier list, and there are definitely characters in the S tier and all that stuff, just like Yu-Gi-Oh! But what's interesting is that just like Edison format, despite what characters in the top 20 S tier or whatever, you can still lose to any character basically if the person playing it is good enough and if the build is good enough and all that stuff. So like in Edison, I would say that an anti-meta deck like the one we just did on our channel by Nick Dukes that played triple D Fisher, double Macrocosmos and all that stuff, that deck I would probably put that in like C tier, right? Like that is not what I would consider a good deck. But if I'm playing anything in S tier, I pretty much don't want to play against it because all the S tier decks have a bad matchup against Macrocosmos and D Fisher, right? Like that's just how that works. It doesn't mean that the Macrocosmos D Fisher deck is good, even though it has a good matchup against certain decks. It's also very fragile. And if you play against someone who's drawing their Heavy Storms of MSTs or Regeki Breaks or whatever in their S tier deck, they're probably just going to win because they only need to break through once, and then it's going to show immediately how overpowered the S tier deck is compared to the anti-meta deck that's summoning shit like DD Survivor and Guardian Yados. And then also when it comes to bracket luck, you have to hope that you don't play against the opponent who's going to draw their best hand against you, because there are people who obviously aren't that good at the game, but then when they play against you, they will draw their absolute nuttiest hand. And this happens a lot against Lightsworn. It happens against Blackwings, like, you know, the opening Whirlwind Shura. It is the scariest opening in the game besides Lightsworn going like charge, recharge, milling a ton of wolves and all that stuff. But those openings, they kind of invalidate you. They don't care who's across from them at all. Like, you could be playing whatever you want. If somebody's just going to open the nuts, it just kind of sucks for you because your bracket gets blown up. You're basically getting upset by a player who may not be as skilled or just having their luckiest moment in this round only. And so that's also like a part of your bracket luck too. Like, I never want to play against, in any given tournament, Lightsworn or Blackwings. I'm always nervous that they're going to have their crazy hand. I'd rather play against Blackwings, though I think Lightsworn is a little bit more uncontrollable. But the point is that those decks can draw those hands that are just absolutely insane. Same with Dragon Turbo. Like, I shit on Dragon Turbo a lot. I give that deck a lot of shit. But I will say, I don't want to play against it. And that's because when it's working, there is nothing you can do. You just have to sit there and hold that. Like, they are going to beat you. There's no combination of cards that you could really have that'll get you through it. And if it sucks when you're the person that's sitting there watching that happen, as opposed to the person who's beating on them because they bricked. Another thing that could happen is you run into somebody who's metagaming really hard, so they're main decking cards that they probably shouldn't be. And that kind of sucks because you can run into somebody playing a deck with main deck DD Crow, right? Like, I think I actually did play against somebody in a recent tournament online, and they were playing the Frog deck. They were playing Frogs. I don't know which version of Frogs it was, but I was playing Christiasworn, and in game one, I activated Plague Splitter Zombies effect, and they DD Crow'd me. And I was like, what the hell? Like, this is a Frog deck. Like, sir, this is Wendy's. So that's clearly a metagame choice because you've never seen a Frog deck top with DD Crow in the main deck. That's just not a thing. It's never been a thing. That person also did not top, obviously, but things like that just really suck. I've also played against YGO Turbo deck before, round one in a tournament. I think it was an RBET. It was on stream. And game one, my opponent DD Crow'd me. And they only played one, I found out. But they DD Crow'd me game one when I used Phantom of Chaos on their lair. So it was like, stuff like that, when you run into people who are metagaming and you happen to be the deck that they're metagaming against, it just sucks. It blows up your bracket because the reality is that most of us just want to play against decks that are normal, decks that we expect to play against, like YGO Turbo, Hero Beat, Diva Hero Beat, Blackwings, you know, Lightsworn, like all of those decks that we know are in the format, Diva Hero, Fairies, Quick Draw, whatever. You know, all the decks that are in A and S tier, you expect to play against those decks. And if you honestly do play against just those decks, you're probably in a pretty good spot because that's also probably what you've been testing against the most. And if you run into something obscure, it can really just throw you off. Like, I've never played against the Gemini deck before. I have no idea what exactly I'm supposed to be doing against that deck. And that's the deficiency with myself, where I'm just not really too concerned about it because it's so low on a totem pole of representation that mathematically I just should not run into that deck. It's not popular enough for me to actually run into it in any given tournament. But if I did, I would have to probably learn on the fly what I'm doing. And obviously that sucks when you have to read cards, when you have to figure out what stuff is doing as you're playing it. Is not the best spot to be in. So every time you look at a top 8 of any tournament, right, just know, and like I said in the beginning with that quote, just know that the person is probably good in top cut, right? If you made top 8, like, they're probably a decent enough player, but then they're also 100% lucky, either because their bracket was exactly what they wanted to play against, or their bracket just didn't have anything anti what they're playing against. And if it did, they happen to draw their outs and stuff like that. Like, if you play against anti-meta, you know, and you have Snowman Eaters and Dust Tornadoes in your side deck and you just draw them, then sure, you Dust Tornado Macrocosmos and Snowman Eater the DD Survivor, and their deck just falls apart from that one little interaction. I've literally won a game because I went set Dust Tornado pass, and my opponent had King Tiger turn 1, and he summoned Thunder King. So he has King Tiger, Thunder King in a back row, and he goes attack, and I go Dust Tornado his back row, drop Gores, and literally from that one interaction, just setting Dust Tornado and passing against the anti-meta deck, that one interaction won me the entire game. Like, I basically won as soon as I went draw, turned both to attack. He didn't have any more back row or anything like that. Or maybe I had Heavy Storm too, I forget. But it was just like a complete blowout from the Gores. And yeah, that was me being lucky against the anti-meta deck that could have easily ruined my entire tournament if they had drawn, like, you know, a certain combination of cards that my deck does not want to see, especially as early as turn 1. All that being said, I do think the solution is to make your side decks less focused on only a few matchups and try to build them in a way where they cover multiple matchups, and don't be afraid to just side deck one of cards. Like, even my friend, a true hero, right? He sides one of cards, like one Smash and Ground, one Vanity's Fiend, one Nobleman of Crossout, one Soul Release, one Light Mirror, one Mask of Restrict, one DD Crow, one Consecrated. These are all one ofs in the side deck. And obviously this isn't applicable to everything, right? Because at the same time, Value Turbo side deck is usually just 2s and 3s of every single card, except like Kaiku and Deck Devastation Virus. But everything else, they literally play multiple copies of, and they can get away with that because that's how their deck just functions. But I'd be willing to bet that even that deck can adapt and start to do like less of 3 copies of cards and 2 copies of cards and do more one-ofs as the format progresses and as things start to become more clear to us, because we're all still learning what exactly hurts decks the most. And it's one of the questions that I get a lot of, like, how do I side against this deck, or how do I side against that deck? And the truth is, all of that is still being figured out. Like, some cards work better than others. You just have to figure out what works best for you, what do you think has the most success, and just go for it. But yeah, as I always say, you need luck to win. Every single person who's ever won any tournament ever in anything has had some level of luck throughout the bracket. And a lot of times it's out of our control what decks we play against, or, you know, how lucky our opponent's going to be when we do play against them. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please give it a like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And I will catch you in the next one. Peace.